Hi, everybody. My name is Bob Schumacher. I'm here on our Global User Research webinar series. I want to talk secondly about some things to think about. These are things to think about, not necessarily because I'm trying to impart a whole bunch of design principles here, but really the kinds of things that we need to think about when we do research as to why things may or may not work out the way that they do, or the way that they were designed. I mean, if you recall in the first webinar on some of the benefits of doing research, we really want to get closer to our customer. We also want to build the designs to help protect against, any sort of market erosion or loss. And lastly, we think that there is a chain of inspiration that we can get from all of our research efforts if we do global user research. So here, I want to point out a few very specific things. So first of all, when we think about doing global user research, we really want to look at meaningful differences that will impact the behavior of our users. So typically we think about language, we think about culture, but those elements of language and culture actually work their way into a lot of different aspects of user interface design, and therefore are the kinds of things that we think about when we do research. So first and foremost, obviously language and culture are the most obvious issues. I mean, you can have words that are mistranslated, you can have subtle meanings that are different, and those kinds of things can have a negative impact on the perception of the users in market. For instance, we were doing research in Brazil at one point, and instead of the word homepage that was used, it was house. And the participants literally laughed as they saw this, because the naivete of whoever did the translation in the context was something that made the users feel like this was not a credible website. So when we look at localization and the kinds of things that we would want to worry about relative to the research, there's obviously language. In Japanese, for instance, there are 4 different alphabets that could be used, and so when a form pops up, which alphabet is the typical user going to use? And there's a context that surrounds that, and knowing the correct alphabet is important, but signaling to the user what alphabet is to be used, or enabling all of those different alphabets, is a really important function. There's also differences in spelling and word choice. We'll get into that. There are some issues on writing direction. Are you designing for a left to right audience? Are you designing for a right to left audience? And if they're meant to be mirrored, if you're going into Hebrew or into Arabic from English or another Latin language, what implications does that have on the user? And then last, let's take an interesting look at keyboards. Obviously, if you've never really spent any time overseas and you're designing a single way in which to enter information, you sort of think of the standard US QWERTY keyboard, and QWERTY obviously because of the letters up above. But in much of Europe, and in France in particular, they use what's called AZERTY, so the keys are not in the same place. And it depending upon the kinds of expectations that you have of your users, it can create certain behavior problems. A particular instance is in Microsoft Office. There's such a strong association with the Control S as being an underline. It's not, Control S is not used for save, it's used for underline in Italian. So that there's differences not only in the layout of the keyboards, but also there's differences in the associations of the control keys. So we can't make certain assumptions without understanding what the learnings are in the local market. If we look at other aspects, so you have things in, when we try to localize in design, various titles mean things and in different cultures. we represent holidays and pick out days differently depending upon the culture. Weights and measures are important, as well as local names. I'll just pick out holidays as a key instance here. And this is more about conducting the user research. If you ever need to do user research in Arab countries, for example, avoiding Ramadan is a pretty good bit of advice. If you do have to test during Ramadan, it becomes very difficult in terms of times of day in order to get people and the kinds of people that you're able to recruit. So these are specific elements in the design process or in the research process that one has to take care of. But let's take a specific example of weights and measures. If you're going to be designing for lots of different places, for instance, for shoe sizes, and this is one example, but the kinds of measures that are used in different areas of the world really beg to have different representations in the user interface design. And if we've only accounted for one or two of these designs, and then we decide to move the user interface to other parts of the world, we have to have accommodations in the user interface and also need to be able to do the testing to see, can we get away with just using one or two of these with a standalone table, or do we need to write different tables for each part of the world? I think the main point is just being aware that there are different weights and measures in other areas of the world can be highly beneficial for the design, and then that awareness will build during testing. I think another kind of subtle example here is when we look at the local names, particularly in bilingual countries, and you can imagine in a situation where you have to enter local names, and you're in Japan and you have to enter the word for London. Do you actually enter London, or do you enter the local equivalent script? In Russian, do you allow the entry of the Latin script, or do you want to accept everything only in Russian? And then you have similar examples of differences when people start to look at names in bilingual countries. Particularly Belgium is a case where cities, the second largest city is Antwerp, but in the French-speaking world, it's Anvers. So how do you enable the user to be able to enter this information? Do you allow both of those entries to go in? Do you allow only one? And how do you want this to feel to the user in order for it to be sort of very localized to their own world? I think the last, coming down to the bottom left panel, sorting Chinese characters. We've had instances when we are testing in China, and you see the Chinese characters there, which have no particular alphabetization as we would know it in the West. Instead, most of the cities are grouped according to the tiers: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, with the largest cities being represented first. However, I've seen cases where Western companies would list the cities alphabetic in English, and then they would just do the straight translation over to Chinese. And so if you're a Chinese user and you're looking down the list, you see Beijing, and then you don't see Shanghai until near the bottom of the list. And if you're looking at 15 or 20 different names there, it seems very odd to a Chinese user that Beijing and Shanghai would be separated by an arbitrary alphabetization in English. There's also certain localizations that we'll see in other kinds of designs, and icons and symbols and color palettes. And we often hear this and feel this in a lot of the conversation when we look at design. But these kinds of designs and symbols can have implications for the research, and have implications for how we would want to look at the various elements. So a very specific example here in most of the Western world, you see the common representations of male and female for the toilet, for the restrooms. But that begins to break down when you begin to look at parts of the Arab world where a long flowing robe, in fact, could mean male or female. And you have to actually, obviously, add labels to it to help differentiate between the two. There's also issues, particularly with the level of page density. It's been documented several times that the page densities in the Asian world tend to be much more dense than those in the West. And you can see examples here. The two left examples are from Walmart. The center example is Chinese, and the left example is from a US version of Walmart. The Chinese examples tend to be far more detailed, far richer, but ones that most Western users, most American users would look at and say, oof, that's too much information. I'd rather dig down from the top level, sort of snack on the information rather than get it all up front. And it's not just Walmart. You can see Carrefour that has sort of similar kinds of design. And then the interesting thing is these two patterns on the right tend to be pages that are familiar both in style and substance to what a local Chinese company would produce. Last, let's talk a little bit about some of the other elements: currency, postcodes, telephones. These all these layout formats can be really frustrating and very confusing oftentimes. If we take a look at currencies, currencies are often represented differently. You know, in the U.S. we tend to use a period to separate the decimal from the digits on the left, and you see you can separate with it by a period, and then to the right you have the decimal, and to the left you have each one of the sets of numbers. In Germany and in other parts of Europe, they'll use a comma to do a decimal separator and a period to do what we in the US would use as a period separator. The French will use blank spaces, but the curious one is to take a look at the Indian separators. They start with a period and then do a group of two, and then group of three, and then groups of two. Which, if you're accustomed to that, it's not a problem. But if you're really selling to an Indian audience who is very accustomed to seeing this kind of layout, a North American layout or a US layout or a British layout would be extremely confusing at this point in time. Last, let's take a look at a couple of different variations on address blocks. There are a variety of different address blocks that are used, and often these can be found, you can find these pretty readily on the web, but I've been in tests where I've just heard where American companies have put up a typical address block, and it's very confusing. And in fact, you know, most people can get around these issues, but they do it, and then they feel as if it's not designed for them. They would much rather go in and use an address block, or at least understand that the address block is built for them in their culture. And so, for instance, on the French address block over here, you would put your postcode first and then your city. What we tend in the US is to put our city, state, and then zip code. And that's the way that we do it. But if you just port that over, it's likely to give a negative impression to the local user. And then the Japanese address blocks are really much different than the rest, and I've sort of illustrated them there. They start with the name and then go into the postcode, and then add all of the detail bits after that. In essence, when we do the design, obviously we want to think global. We want to find out as much as we can about the local markets that we're going into, and then we want to act local. But the essence here is we can do everything we in our power to try to get this correct. And then, in fact, we still have to test it to get it right, because we've got to put it out there in order to make sure that we really did learn our lessons from the design guidance that we got, some of the things I pointed to earlier, but there are many things to think about. My name is Bob Schumacher, and here's my contact information. Thank you.